So this is one of the panels. By the way, this was in our run of show. This is a Voice of God introduction, but certainly I don't qualify for that. We are excited to welcome these 6 distinguished panelists. Ashley Allison from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, Jeff Robinson from the ACLU, Mayor G.T. Bynum from Tulsa, Oklahoma, Jason Hernandez, Soros Justice Fellow, Kim Foxx, State's Attorney in Cook County, Illinois, and Candace Jones from the Public Welfare Foundation on this conversation on race, bias, and disparities. Let's welcome them to the stage.
Thank you, Ed, and all the partners, and John Jay, who is hosting us for this, and Carol Mason, thank you so much for hosting us here. We're going to have a conversation on race, bias, and disparities in the criminal justice system. You really can't talk about criminal justice without talking about race and disparities when you think of policing practices and the way we incarcerate Black and brown bodies and the way we release them back into society without a true safety net to ensure success. So we have a distinguished panel here that sit at different points of experience and authority in our criminal justice system. And we're gonna jump right in and hopefully have a time for a few questions and answers from the audience. So I ask everyone to just refer to the electronic bios. We're not gonna do a long introduction so we can just get straight to the conversation. And I wanna start with a question for everyone. We are all here as advocates in some form of criminal justice reform, but there's still a lot of work we need to do. So if we can just start at the end with Candace, can you each talk for a couple of minutes about what are we doing wrong here? You know, when we think about race and criminal justice, what haven't we got right to start the conversation?
I don't think this is really the beginning of the conversation. So that's probably the first thing that we got wrong. You know, in the 15 years that we've been working on justice, youth justice, and adult criminal justice reform, there was really a period of time that was and still exists where nobody wanted to talk about race, in part because we argued that it would polarize and push people away. We couldn't have that conversation because people would immediately shut down. And the truth is that in our work, we've used it as a shield and a sword. There are people who say, oh, well, if you say race, then you're making me a racist, and so I can't engage in that conversation. And other people who say, you know, there are only a set of good guys and bad guys in this work, and so other people have to shut out. And so we've allowed that really to sort of stall work on having this conversation when we know that we need to have it. And because the racial disparities in the system are, you know, it's sort of laughable. Like if there was a Greek chorus off in the corner, they're laughing at the fact that we're trying to act like this system is not all just about our history of racial terror. When, you know, Khalil was up talking about immigration, and he's like, you know, it's not, I mean, the truth is that in this nation, we are still just dealing with a crisis of human bondage that groups profit off of. And that's in immigration detention, that's in the criminal justice system, and we have a long, like, multi-hundred-of-year history with that. So we are really sort of just having a crisis of not getting to the place where we can meaningfully have that conversation and not really allow anybody to shut down.
Thank you. State's Attorney?
Thank you. I echo what Candace said, but I also would suggest that there are some folks who believe that we have done a lot in talking about race because we use the word, we talk about it, that there's this faux wokeness of folks in the criminal justice system who are like, yes, we care about, you know, Black and brown communities, and, you know, it's so intractable, we can only do so much, which then allows for like the smallest of steps to be taken, which will then seem monumental because 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we weren't doing that. So there's not a real pushing of the agenda. I think, you know, to Candace's point, you can anecdotally go into any jail. I'll just use Cook County, for example, and it is mostly Black and brown. I think we're around 86% African American and Latino in our jail, and still have the conversation of, doesn't this disparity scream out to you as something being inherently wrong? And the retreat of, well, these are the folks who are caught up in the system. And then feeling like, well, I can only do my part. And even, you know, as a prosecutor, you know, in prosecution, it's been, I get what is given to me, right? That people will assume their role. So if you have an assembly line justice system, well, I can't tell the police who to arrest or how they police a certain neighborhood. If someone has committed an infraction and then comes to me, I'm not responsible for any systemic racist ideology that existed before it got to me. I'm only reacting to that. And I think that absolves people of their responsibility to do more. It absolves people of their responsibility to be able to say, hey, police, perhaps your strategy for policing these neighborhoods is racist. Or hey, when we talk about schools, your discipline practices that end up coming to our juvenile court system are flawed. But because we don't want to call out other people's issues, we stay in our silo and allow for a system to fester. And we'll go to a conference on race and say, yo, I went to a conference, I'm better. And people will accept that. I think there's been this general acceptance that we have been talking about race, and so that's enough. And then we just go back into our silos and say, well, that's the part that I have no control over, and let the system continue to do what the system does.
Jason?
Well, I think it's obvious race and the criminal justice system, I mean, they're intertwined. You can't say one without the other. But I've learned, and I think that what I see that's happening is that we're repeatedly saying race, 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 and those that we're trying to change, trying to affect, they just close us off, right? So we're in this echo chamber. We all know this problem, but it's about reaching out to those who don't think that it exists and who are actually implemented on a day-to-day process. And I think it boils down to connection, empathy, and the lack thereof. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is that if there's a judge, and primarily, I mean, majority of, especially in the state and the local counties, 95% of the elected officials, judge, prosecutors are Caucasian. And we also have 80% of the police force across the United States are Caucasian. So what is the solution, right? Everybody thinks, well, we need more minorities. We need more minority officers, more minority prosecutors, judges. And I do believe that to an extent. But what's happening is that I was at a conference, and I always believe that, right? Because when I go speak to primarily minority students in law schools, I say, you want to change the system, you got to change the prosecutors who are there. But is that enough? You have to change their mindset, everybody's mindset. And what I mean by that is that what I have found in my personal experience, I was formerly incarcerated, is that usually that, and I'm sure you're one of the exceptions, right? Usually the Hispanic or African American officer, judge, prosecutor, they're one of the worst ones, right? I was at an ACTO conference, and a public defender attorney said, in Louisiana, you do not want an African American judge. You do not want an African American jury. They're the worst. And when she told me that, I was like, you know what, she's right. That was my experience as well. So what happens, right? How can we imagine or assume that if we have more minorities in those positions that it's going to make a change? And it's actually not, right? What is that problem? Where not only the people that are there are already biased to an extent, but that the people that we're trying to put there, they're turning as well. A majority of them, not all of them. But I think that's a good discussion when we leave here today. What is happening? And I think it's a lack of empathy, compassion, that there is no connection between the defendant and the one that's arresting them, the one that's prosecuting them, or the one that's imposing the sentences. So it's that empathy. It's a strong word, and a lot of it has to do with race. That's why there's not that connection. But I think that when we start talking about empathy, that's when we can solve this problem.
I'm going to come back to you to talk a little bit about the empathy with your personal experience, but Mayor, if you wouldn't mind responding to the question.
No, I think that's a great point. And I can talk about what we've seen in Tulsa, because I think it's illustrative of what other cities have dealt with, which is that over the last several decades, you've had two phenomena occur. One is an increase in the valuation of expertise, and then also cities that have tight budgets to work with that allowed over decades their police forces to largely move into being in reactive mode. And so what happens then is you have police officers who respond to one call to another, who end up spending their whole shift working either with victims or suspects. And for your average everyday citizen, unless they happen to know a police officer personally, their only interaction with a police officer is going to be one of confrontation. And so when you allow that type of relationship to creep in, what you have is, at least what we've seen, is everyone just assumes that public safety, that's the police's job and the prosecutor's job, and criminal justice is up to them. When the reality is that criminal justice in a community is relying on the community. It is every citizen's job in that community to help make the community safer. But when you have that division and that assumption of sole responsibility on law enforcement personnel, that's when you have the breakdown in dialogue, in empathy, in talking about race that we see in our country right now. And I think only by reversing that trend, moving more towards a community policing model, which you see cities across the country right now trying to do you reverse that and get back to a place where officers and citizens view one another as allies in making a community safer, having that empathy, being able to have difficult conversations around the disparities that we do see in our criminal justice system. But at the moment, we have set both sides up for failure through these two trends that we've seen over the last couple of decades.
Thank you. And Jeff?
I may be the most experienced person on this panel, meaning the oldest. I'm 62, and I was born in Memphis, Tennessee in 1956. And in 1967, when I was 11, the Kerner Report came out. It actually came out in 1968, in March of 1968, about 3 weeks before King was assassinated. And it came out because Lyndon Johnson asked the report to be done after the summer of '67, probably the most violent summer in the history of the United States, in some ways anyway. And that report talked about the problems with race in America. In March of this year, the Economic Policy Institute, in the same week, 50 years after the Kerner Report, came out with a report, and they said that there has been zero progress in how blacks compare to whites when it comes to incarceration, jobs, and home ownership. I understand incremental change, but the second word, change, has to be part of that calculation, or the first word, incremental, essentially means never. And so much of what I point to as the problem is with everybody sitting in this room, and I include myself in that, because I started to discover the true history of our racialized country in my mid-50s. I went to Marquette University and Harvard Law School. I've had one of the best educations in America, and I was angry and humiliated about how much I did not know. And I'm willing to bet that 99% of the people in this room are ignorant about our history of race. And so if you want to know why we're not talking about it, it's because we were never taught it and we don't know it. And here's the lucky thing. This history is hidden, but it's hidden in plain sight. And so when we talk about conversations like Kim was talking about, and we go to a conference and we say, oh, we talked about race, it's like, actually, no, we really didn't. And so one obligation I would suggest is that we start informing ourselves about our true history of race, because if we don't start there, if we don't have a common baseline of understanding about what race has done in America, then going forward is virtually impossible, because we're all talking about different things. And we need to have a common understanding. And that's not an understanding based on politicians or advocates who will use adjectives to describe our history. It's an understanding of who we were and what Americans throughout history have done and said about race. And when we deal with that, I think we have a common playing field or a common ground where we can start to have a conversation that actually makes sense.
All right. So, by no stretch of the imagination do we think that an hour-long panel is going to get to the root problems of everything that just was unsurfaced in the first 10 minutes. But Jason, I want to go back to you because you talked about empathy. And maybe just a part of what Jeff was talking about is when he talks about things being right in front of our face. You were were given a life sentence for a nonviolent drug offense. And you were commuted by President Obama. And the question that comes up over and over is we are seeing now an opioid crisis in many communities, and we are seeing different treatment being given to different people who may be white, predominantly white. And so as someone, I really find it important to center these conversations on people's lived experiences. And so I want to hear, when you talk about empathy and you think about the sentence that you received, if you were a white person, do you think you would have gotten that sentence if it was related to an opioid substance? And do you think your sentence was fair?
Well, just to make two quick points real quick. Again, there's no doubt in my mind that race and the criminal justice system are, go hand in hand. And two, right, whether my sentence was fair or not, I mean, I realize that there's other countries where what I was doing, selling drugs, I would not have went to prison, right? Would not have gotten prosecuted. But I also realize that there's countries where I would have probably been executed, right? I also, based on my experience with social media now, I mean, my people in my community, people across the society are kind of split on me personally being free. There's a lot of people who say you should be out. It's good that you're out. But when I follow social media, there's another aspect of that where they're like, you should have never gotten out. You and President Barack Obama should be cellies together, right? So, but I do a little bit of Facebook stalking, right? So, because I want to try to understand what are these people doing? Why don't they like me? Why do they think I should have died in prison for what I did? And I'm extremely sorry for what I did. I believe that I should have went to prison. There's no doubt in my mind that I was poisoning my community, and I deserve to be punished for that. Now, I was in prison for crack cocaine, and the person who was giving me the powder cocaine and I converted it into crack, he received a 10-year sentence. Now, I say that because from the hundreds of people that I know that are serving or that were serving life without parole for crack cocaine were either African American or Latino. Never met a person that was white serving life without parole for crack cocaine. I've never met a person that was white serving any sentence for crack cocaine. Now think about it. Not saying that there's not, but I had a feeling. I had this. I could have filed for clemency when other presidents were in office, but I didn't, right? Because I just felt they don't understand. I don't relate to them. They don't relate to me. President Barack Obama, I felt that if anybody gets it, it's him. I felt that I related to him, right? He's African American, I'm Hispanic, but I still felt a connection to him. And I felt that he would feel that same connection with me and everybody else across the board. And what we know with clemency is that if the president is Caucasian, is white, he's more than likely going to give majority of clemency recipients, they're going to be white. And with President Barack Obama, he flipped it on its head, right? He gave nearly 80% of the people that received clemency were minorities. And rightfully so, because a majority of them were crack cocaine offenders. Now, does that mean that Barack Obama is racist against white people in prison? No, it don't. It's just there was that compassion, that connection. And I'll try to make it real quick because I want to give everybody a chance to talk. And what I mean by that empathy and connection and how it plays into effect, and I'm pretty sure everybody is following the Kavanaugh nomination right now, right? Now look at that. Look at the facts there. Here we have a man who's accused of sexually assaulting a lady as a minor, right? And what do we have the Republicans saying? One, they're saying, it didn't happen, and if it did, he was a minor. You shouldn't consider that. What do we know about Republicans? We know that they're more likely to support execution of a juvenile that commits a felony offense. We know that Republicans are in favor of sending juveniles to life imprisonment as well. But now there's a flip side to that coin. Democrats are saying it doesn't matter that he's a juvenile, that when he did that, he should be held responsible for that. What do we know about Democrats and the Supreme Court justices when they rule on cases that involve juveniles? Democrats are more likely to say, no, they do say that that kid should not be executed because he's a juvenile. That kid should not be in prison for the rest of his life because he's a juvenile. He doesn't understand. But yet now we have Democrats saying Kavanaugh should be held responsible for his crimes despite of him being a juvenile. Both of those, the Republicans and Democrats, their strict beliefs about juvenile justice and punishment are flipped entirely on its head now. Why? Because there's compassion, there's empathy, there's connection between the Republicans and Kavanaugh, and there is none between the Democrats and Kavanaugh. So it is that, again, it's that empathy. It's just like your son or daughter could do something bad, and what are you going to say? That's my baby, right? Give him a chance. But if that's not your baby, you're like, you know what? So be it. You deal with the consequences.
So I do want to just say this is a nonpartisan event, but I appreciate just
and I tried
to give John Jay the coverage. But Candace, I think you wanted to respond.
No, I just wanted to jump in, because I want to be really clear of literally killing certain communities, the one I come from and call home. So I want to be really careful of that, because I come from a city where there is a Democratic, and these are my words, no one else on the panel, is a very powerful Democratic machine in place for a lot of years, and the communities of color that one is the top segregated city and has been since the 1960s when you cite that report, and continues to be, and communities of color are literally hemorrhaging. So I want to be really clear about the game of politics in these issues. I also just want to go back to the point made about where we are from the 1960s and just caution us to hold both a sense of the need to sort of atone and learn and educate, but be really urgent about what is a crisis issue at the same time. And I think humans are complicated characters and can do that, because the truth is that I am not convinced that we are in the same place that we were in the 1960s. I would actually offer that we're worse in communities of color, because if 200,000 people were in prison and the percentage was the same, and now there are millions of color who are in bondage and therefore suffering. And so I think in the process of us sort of learning and educating and atoning as a nation for all these issues, we actually have to get pretty concrete quickly on how we're going to address this stuff. We don't have another couple of generations to sacrifice. That's right.
State's Attorney Foxx, I want to come to you. I think you were a shining light in our criminal justice system for many of us when you were elected. And you ran on bringing more transparency to your office. And I just want to, change is hard. We're talking about how race is not really dealt with. And you are in Chicago. What are the challenges that you are facing in your seat? And maybe
On the campaign trail, I was running for unicorn in chief because people like me don't occupy these seats. But it's me, from public housing, who came from a firsthand someone's life. I have more than the lawyers who work for me. Factors of poverty, we look at racial sex, having been sexually assaulted. As we see that the people who have those and as victims. And so to run the race, those issues, that it wasn't just black people who have these same factors that I do. And the complicatedness, to Candace's point, of humanity, of I have people in my family who have been perpetrators of violence. The person who sexually assaulted me was a relative who I still have Thanksgiving dinner with. I've seen people who have done horrible things and do incredibly wonderful things. That the justice system sees people as all good, all evil. And I could literally sit at a table with people who have all of those lived experiences in themselves. And so that's what I was running on, right? That was running on that we have to stop talking about criminal justice in these like binary positions, that it is this concrete good versus bad, because that's how you get to where we get, right? And how, to the point about race, how every piece of those factors, whether it's in education or housing or economics, all of those things where we see these huge disparities, the criminal justice system is where it ends, right? It's not where it begins. If you don't have ability for affordable housing, I was homeless when I was 16. There's a constellation of issues that come with that. When we talk about mental health, my mother suffered from bipolar depression and smoked marijuana regularly to calm herself. I see those people in our jails, but the access to mental health and drug treatment in communities of color are almost absent. So that overrepresentation in our justice system of those folks is not by accident. And so I think for me, those things are really important to be rooted in. The challenges are, of course, you inherit a system that has operated in the way that it's operated for well over a century, in a city that is reckoning with a reputation of violence. Some of that reputation well-deserved, and some of that reputation has been exploited for political purposes. That when we talk about, gun control, or when we talk about, community enrichment, they say, well, what about Chicago? That the people who are suffering or in harm's way in Chicago have become political fodder for people in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere. And so when you're having conversations about bail reform, the narrative becomes, well, we have all this violence in the street because you're letting people out, because people don't even understand what bail is, right? So there's this whole education campaign that has to start, that I think, for me, I wasn't contemplating that people were not as knowledgeable about the system as they were. I think I believe in meeting people where they are, and I think I was meeting people on the 50-yard line, and we need to be at the 5-yard line, and having those conversations at the same time where we're contending with violence. I mean, so that's the biggest struggle, is that there are communities that are hurting, that are suffering. We also have issues with trust. We have, a homicide clearance rate in the city of Chicago, with all of that you hear about the murder rate, of 17%. They only closed 17% of homicides in 2017. A non-fatal shooting clearance rate is about 5%. So you
would say 2, but
Candace,
I think it was 2%.
Candace is from Chicago too, but she playing us now that she's in DC. But okay, let's say between 2 and 5%. So you have these communities that are impacted by violence who believe that people can perpetrate violence with impunity. And the systems holders who will make that not about the breakdown in the relationship, or the breakdown in how we treated these communities, but about a moral valuation on the people who live there, which then turns people off more. And so I think the challenges for me have been talking about reform in a way that is realistic, to not just be incremental, trying to be bold, trying to take stances that are outside of the norm, talking to the constituents who use our systems the most. I think people who run for this position of state's attorney, they, if you have a big urban area and you have a big suburban area around it, they play to the suburbs and the fear in the suburbs, as opposed to playing to the people who are the users, the victims, and those who've caused harm, who live in our communities, and saying how we do that better. So those have been the challenges. What I would ask for this group, you asked, is that we engage in, because I think when we talk about reform, there's an exciting time that you have more and more prosecutors who are engaging in this, and there's this tendency to want to say, well, this person is more reform-minded than this person has done this really, the thing that we did on data, we had the capacity to do. There's some people who may not have that capacity, but should certainly be working towards it, but it doesn't mean that whatever it is that they're working on in their jurisdiction is any less impactful. And so I think when we talk about reform, let's not get into the rock stardom of what these races seem like they've become as of late, and get into the substance of the work that needs to be done on the ground.
Thank you. Mayor, I want to come to you as a mayor of Tulsa, Oklahoma. You are responsible for helping to build that trust in communities, and you are a Republican, and you are speaking out in support of criminal justice reform. And so I have a 2-part question. Is how are you going about navigating building the trust in your community on many issues, whether it be policing or on criminal justice reform? And what do you think? I agree with Candace that it's not going to be solved by one party or the other, but criminal justice is now a conversation that has bipartisan support. And what do you think we need to do to make sure that more Republicans, because it couldn't get passed through the Senate, even if you thought it was a good bill or not, because it was blocked by Republicans, what do you think we need to do to get more people, particularly elected officials in your position like a mayor, to come out and support reform?
Sure. First, just to kind of lay the background on the issues we've dealt with in Tulsa. In 1920, Tulsa was home to one of the most vibrant African-American economies in the country. The Greenwood section of our city, just north of downtown Tulsa, was known as Black Wall Street around the United States. And one day, a young lady gets on an elevator in downtown Tulsa at a store, and the elevator is operated by a young African-American man. Doors close. When they open on the next floor, she comes out and says that he's assaulted her. He's taken to prison, or to our local jail, locked up, and that night we had commence what is regarded broadly as the worst race riot in the history of the country.
Except it wasn't a riot. I'm sorry, Mayor. It wasn't a
You're
riot.
getting ahead of me, man. Let me talk. I'm just about to get there. So anyways, as I was saying, so it was called the worst race riot in American history, and the Greenwood district was essentially burned to the ground that evening, displacing that economy. There was rebuilding afterward, but it never saw the type of vibrancy that it had. Now, more recently, we've locally really revisited even what we call that event, because to call it a riot implies that it was a two-sided affair, when in reality it was a massacre. To this day, we don't know how many African American citizens of our city were killed, because there are unmarked graves around our community. We may never know. I say that from a standpoint of background because that really led forward, if you move forward about 90 years, is why I ran for mayor. There was a report that came out about a decade ago showing, and that area is still the predominantly African American part of our city. 10 years ago, the life expectancy disparity between a kid growing up in that part of the city versus a different part of our city, any other part of the city, was 15 years. Now, in September of 2015, I was sitting at home on a Sunday morning with my wife and kids reading the paper, and there was an article lauding the progress we'd made, because now, after a decade of hard work, that life expectancy disparity is 11 years. Now, on the one hand, 4 years, that's a great improvement, and a lot of people worked hard to make that happen. But the reality is, today, you can break down all the differences in access to jobs, access to education, transportation, healthcare, all these things. But when it comes down to it, a kid that's growing up in one part of our city versus another is getting robbed of over a decade of their life. And as a father of two little kids, I thought about their parents and how the children, the parents of those kids, mean as much to them as my kids do to me, and yet I didn't hear anybody talking about it locally. And so that is why I decided to run for mayor. And of course, anyone who's run for office gets to deal with consultants. Consultants thought that was maybe the worst thing I could possibly be running on, is bringing up in every part of our city this disgrace and point of shame in our city's history. And to the point that was made earlier, really the lack of progress that has been made in almost a century. But I felt like I didn't know if I was going to win or not. I was running against an incumbent, but if nothing else, I could get the message out around town. And the most redeeming thing about that campaign was it didn't matter if I was talking in the whitest, most Republican part of the city, or the most Democratic, or the most independent, whatever it might be. Everyone that found out about that statistic, that 11-year life expectancy disparity, one, was horrified by it and didn't know about it, and two, wanted to know what they could do to help. So when I came in, we partnered with the Rockefeller Foundation and their 100 Resilient Cities program to focus on this life expectancy disparity issue very directly. And the reality is, you can't talk about dealing, and I think everyone on this panel has done a great job of pointing this out, you can't deal with racial disparity in America without dealing with criminal justice reform. They go hand in hand. And so for us, an early area of focus that we saw needed to be around community policing. Yet everyone I asked about community policing, what is community policing, had a different notion of what it was. Some people said, oh, it's body cameras. Other people said it's implicit bias training. Other people said it's having citizen advisory boards. And so what we did in my first day in office, we created a commission on community policing, and we brought together citizens, police officers, and elected officials, and we used as our template President Obama's task force on 21st century policing, and used that and went through and looked at what other cities around the country are doing. And at the end of that commission, they came back to me and said, there are 77 different things that we need to do if you want to implement community policing in Tulsa right away. All of the things that I just talked about, but many more as well. This didn't get any pushback in the community. It didn't get pushback from the Fraternal Order of Police. It was embraced by everyone, and I think, almost everyone, I think the reason for that is that we focused it and the purpose of it, and the motive behind it, in two main areas. One, having a system that is more just and that is operating where you treat everyone equally makes for a safer city because it addresses the issue I talked about earlier, this breakdown between police officers and the communities which they serve, where there isn't trust there. And there needs to be, if citizens are going to work with police officers, to make that community as safe as it can be. The other is something that also is not a partisan issue, and that is, at least in our community, and I imagine in all of yours as well, nearly everyone believes that every kid in your community ought to have an equal opportunity at a great life. That is not a belief set that is the domain of one party or another. And again, you cannot have that exist if you have the disparities that exist within our criminal justice system and within, at least in our community, life expectancy. There are two other areas that we focused on in this regard. The other is that we needed a baseline. You can't just talk about racial disparity in a community, especially, and I want to go back to what you said earlier, this race riot that I just talked about, we had two generations grow up in Tulsa that didn't even know that it existed. 1921 happened, and then we didn't talk about it openly in our community until 2001. So you talk about all authoritarian regimes in foreign countries and how they try to erase history. It almost happened in America right in the middle of the country. Yes, and if it weren't for a group of people that raised the issue, I might not know about it today as mayor. And so now what we're trying to do is have conversations where everyone in our community, well, most of us, are not experienced at talking about race in an elevated way. So we've done two other things. We partnered with the City University of New York in their Equality Indicators program, where they went in and audited all these statistics in our community so you can argue with the causes of these issues, but you can't argue with the numbers. And in Tulsa, the reality is that if you are black, you're 3 times more likely as a juvenile to be arrested, 2.5 times more likely as an adult to be arrested if you're black versus white, and you're 2.5 times less likely to be a police officer in Tulsa if you're black versus white. So those are just facts. And so we put those out publicly. We had a third party here out of New York, the City University of New York, that helped us so that there's no local bias in reporting that. And then we will report on our update of our equality indicators every year. The other thing that we've done is partner with the New American Economy around our Welcoming America program, recognizing the fastest growing population in Tulsa is our immigrant community. I say this again, people are always shocked to hear a Republican talk about how awful our immigrant community gets treated, but the reality is I don't hear things being said today about our immigrant communities that weren't said 100 years ago about my Irish ancestors. It's just the audience gets to, or the accusers have changed over time. So we want to make sure that our immigrant community is as tied in with leadership decisions and decision-making authority in our community around both criminal justice and around opportunity in Tulsa as any other community in Tulsa. All of this to say, when you ask, how do you get more Republicans involved in this conversation? One, I think it's a shame that I seem to be this novelty for some folks as the white Republican from the state where Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton never carried a single county who's talking about the value of immigration and criminal justice reform. But I would just remind all of my fellow Republicans that our party was founded by Abraham Lincoln and his colleagues on the belief that we should overcome slavery, that we should have equal opportunity for all. And that's the founding principle of the Republican Party. But I come back to this notion of equal opportunity in a community for the citizens in a community is not partisan. For the politicians, it may become that way. But for the citizens, it is not. And so the more that we can do to tie the value of criminal justice reform to the opportunity for every kid in that community to have an equal shot at a great life, I think the better the odds are you have of both parties coming on board with it. At least that is my hope.
Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you.
I think we can do 2 questions from the audience. So I don't know if there are microphones, but while that happens, Jeff, I want to come to you. A lot has been said, and I don't know, you can either respond. Do you want us to respond or you want a question?
Maybe I'll just respond.
Okay.
I think the point about empathy is critical, but don't mistake a decision about whether a juvenile goes to prison with a decision about whether somebody serves on the Supreme Court. Those are not the same thing. And holding Kavanaugh accountable for his behavior by not placing him on the Supreme Court is completely appropriate and consistent with both Republicans and Democrats who will say about juveniles, maybe we shouldn't execute them, but we should still hold them accountable. Kavanaugh has never been held accountable, and I think that's just an important thing to understand. And when we think about why there is so much lack of trust between law enforcement and black and brown communities, the Milwaukee police had a procedure that they called the train, where they would go in to make a felony arrest of somebody, and they'd have 6 police cars, one right after the other, lights and sirens flashing. They roll in, kick in a door, they haul the person out, throw them on the ground, knee in the back, handcuff them while the whole community is watching. And then when there's a homicide the next day, they come into that same community, and it's like, oh, why don't you want to talk to us? Maurice Willows was a Red Cross worker who responded with the American Red Cross to the incident the mayor described in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He visited every Red Cross station in Greenwood. His death count was 300 because there were bodies, as the mayor said, that were buried in unmarked graves. At the Oklahoma City bombing, one entire building was destroyed. 168 people dead, including 19 under 6 years old. You saw the kind of apparatus that was engaged in the criminal prosecution of that event, and it was completely appropriate. In the city of Tulsa, after the incident in Greenwood, there were 0 people prosecuted. This is despite the fact that there were pictures of white people with guns, despite the fact that there were airplanes rented at the airport so that burning balls of turpentine could be dropped on black homes and black buildings, because most of those buildings burned from the top. 0 people prosecuted. You can't tell me that the police in Tulsa did not know who rented an airplane that morning. You can't tell me that they didn't know who took guns into that community. And so it is these kind of incidents that come to the breakdown of trust. And as Kim said, it's not that the people in the community have no morals or no concern. That takes me back, and there are people in this room old enough maybe to remember a movie about the Vietnam War called Hearts and Minds, where the American general in charge of the Vietnam War, and his name escapes me, was saying, well, you know, those Viet Cong, they don't view life the same way we do. They don't value life the same way. And while his voice is saying this, they show a picture of a woman holding her dead child and just sobbing incredibly. The ability to differentiate between the us's and the them's is what is, it seems to me, at the heart of this. So I think we don't want to draw false equivalency as we're trying to think about these issues. And I think it's important to understand that there is a reason why we are where we are in 2018.
Thank you. So I do want to do one thing. I want to take your question, and then Candace, because you sit in this position to fund some of the solutions. I mean, I work for a nonprofit. I got to do what I got to do. Many of us do in the room. After she asked her question, I do want you to just provide a little context of the things you're looking for and the things you're seeing that are solutions in communities to help. We talked about a lot here, and I don't think your foundation is going to be able to fund everything to solve it, but some of the things you're seeing in communities to help solve for some of these problems. But please. Yeah,
Thank you so much. I've enjoyed this panel and talking about race, but I want to talk about, are there some action steps that we can actually take to reverse some of the racial biases that we're seeing today? We're talking about using risk assessments and predictive types of things to determine one's risk in our criminal justice system. But have we looked at the fact that the disparities that exist are on paper? There's data that allows us to understand these different ways in which we use our criminal justice systems against minorities versus others. For instance, marijuana, I believe many prosecutors are saying we're no longer prosecuting for marijuana. Have we looked at pardoning or removing some of those things off of records where we know they have been based on disparate policies and practices that have no other value other than the fact that looking at who's using it or who's doing the action? Because I'd like to see some more steps taken by prosecutors. We have a progressive prosecutor in our city. I'm from Philadelphia. And we are looking at the way we treat heroin and crack cocaine. So why don't we just stop prosecuting for drug possession and force our city to find better solutions?
So, well, State's Attorney, if you want to take that, and then Candace, if you want to respond.
Yeah, very quickly, there are efforts across the country where people are doing just that. I think there are some boroughs here in New York where they're vacating convictions for folks with marijuana. I think Brooklyn maybe started with 20,000 and with the plan of doing more. We're in Chicago looking at our data and the mechanics of how we can do that as well. I want to get to your point, though. You're absolutely right. One of the things that we struggle with, for example, in Chicago is everywhere else, is what do we do with people who are suffering from substance abuse disorder? And the struggle that we have is the criminal justice system is not the place to deal with it at all. We know that, hands down, we all agree with that. The tension becomes, there's some neighborhoods in Chicago where the drug market, the drug trade is so open, and those communities and what's happening in those communities are struggling with the violence that is attenuated to it. And so even when I have conversations in those communities saying, listen, we know, I have a cousin who's been addicted to drugs for 30 years. Like, we know that this person has an issue that isn't criminal justice related. And I don't think that we should do this. Those people in those communities said, well, what are you going to do about this open air drug market? Because my kid, to the point that the mayor made, has to walk past this every day to go to school. I don't feel safe as an elderly person sitting on my porch because this trade is happening right in front of me. And so there's a theoretical, there's the, like, how do we reconcile, how do we force, because that's what we believe has to happen, is force other pieces of the the puzzle to do their part. The public health sector has to do their part. The for-profit health sector in Chicago, we have some of the best hospitals in the country, in our city, who has to bear the load of dealing with people who are suffering from these addictions, who don't. You know, we have a great public health system, but they don't have the capacity. So how do we build capacity? And so some of that work is like, listen, if we stop doing it, then perhaps you will stop bringing them to us. But doing it in a way that's thoughtful, doing it in a way that sees the long-term, you know, impact, because it's really difficult knowing conceptually what you should do and having to depend on other stakeholder partners to help you do that. Because if tomorrow we stop treating or stop prosecution of drugs, which I think is really where we should all be, I'm still gonna have the issue. I think in Cook County last year we had 962 heroin overdoses, 962. We still have to do something with that as well. And so I think it is having prosecutors and defense attorneys and the public health sector and all of us come together to say what is the solution, big solution, to deal with these issues rather than unilateral, because I think what then happens is we see it pop up in some other area that is an unintended consequence. But I think you are seeing some of the remedying of past practices related to, I think, marijuana, because you know, it's legal in so many places across the country, and we see the trend where how do you make that equitable in vacating convictions, and then I think hopefully, and as we see people being able to monetize it, making sure that people who have been impacted by the laws have access to be able to get capital for it.
I'll try to tie her question back to yours.
Great, thank you.
I think there are a couple of organizations, not enough and not at scale, that are trying to think about reparations around drug offenses. The Drug Policy Alliance, I think, starting as an organization to talk about race, an issue that they've struggled with, but are moving in that direction and thinking about it in certain states like California, as you start to have legalization, not just changing the way we look at drug convictions, but frankly, people are making lots of money off of it. We can't even figure out as a government yet how to tax it, right? Like, they are making hand over fist, but in most of those states, California and Colorado, it's a very small set of stakeholders who've locked up the entire market. In other states where they're looking at it, you see very strong lobbying from out-of-state partners and also the liquor and beer industries to make sure that, to the extent there's legalization, that they have a monopoly over the distribution and sale, because they'll then be able to reap the benefits, knowing that it was all based on the backs of communities of color. So I think we have a lot of work to do about that, but there are a few very short list of organizations that are starting to think about that, not totally at scale. I'll start by taking your question, answering your shout out from the audience about philanthropy is a part of the issue of race. In a lot of places, but particularly in this work, there was a Peak Grantmakers report recently that says 7%, literally, you can't make this stuff up, that's why I love data. 7% of organizations that get resources are in the communities, the sort of most marginalized communities, the Black and brown communities that we're talking about. You heard me right. I'm not making that up. Look at the report. They put it out there. And this isn't like, it's peak grant makers. These are all the like grant managers and like data analysts in foundations. It's not some like radical policy people. They're just sort of crunching the numbers. We have a real issue there. And I still think that it's novel. I actually just had this conversation with my board. It is still novel to say, oh, we want to fund communities and people who are most impacted, because I think we say it because we think it's the liberal good thing to say, but you still think it's sort of, you think of it in like a charitable way, like somehow by doing it, you'll sprinkle a little change over at these people and everybody will be happy, when it's like so ironic. If you're doing work on the ground, it's those people will do the work whether you fund them or not, because they are fundamentally tied to the issues, right? So it's like, fund it, go ahead and fund it. But it's hard for us, so then I'll shut it, just cut us to an end so you can get done. But I think the things that I am excited about, because I always like to end on a hopeful, and the things that we'll be focusing on, we as a national foundation are really going to try to think about how we get closer to the ground, and that's hard. It's hard for a national organization, it's hard for a smaller organization. There are a lot of people, partners in this room, big national groups, they dominate all the conversation, they dominate all the resources. I bring into this work a real bias, having been one of the people sweating it out on the ground. Those people aren't getting funded. And I don't think that's okay, because they're most proximate to the communities, and they're not at the conferences and the meetings. They are the people that right now are out on the ground sort of like fighting the good fight of the work. And we want to figure out how to fund, partner, and sort of catapult and highlight some of those people in a way that doesn't distract them from the work they want to do. The things that are interesting to me right now, to us right now, are I'm really looking at these places and jurisdictions where they are at scale reinvesting in the communities that are most impacted. Oakland and Alameda counties work, getting that money flowing back to community. The Credible Messengers work in New York and now replicated in DC. Some of the work they're trying to do in Baltimore, there's just not enough of it. But I am really looking at jurisdictions, a little bit in Chicago. I love it, but we are still a little bit of a mess, but an effort to really start to reinvest in the violence work and not locking people up, but getting money and jobs and resources back to those communities. Those are the things that are excited to me, because it's sort of like nobody's gonna save us. Those communities are too resilient. They need resources, because the truth is that the innovations, the ideas, they're not gonna happen in this conference. They're gonna happen there. And we gotta bet there, so.
Thank you. I want to end on that note. Would everyone join me in thanking the panel for a very live and healthy conversation on race, and thank you for having us.